About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. And I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. Now, over the course of these programs, we've focused on some of the models developed to explain our mental and emotional experience and the experiments that have supported them. We've learned that, although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in unconscious processes. From Jung and Freud and other early researchers, we learned that our minds can be thought of as having three aspects. What we are aware of, our personal awareness, and it's usually called the conscious mind. What we aren't aware of that keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, our individual subconscious mind, and what we aren't aware of that enlivens our beings and guides us in our actions, the superconscious mind. We then learned that we can change our state of consciousness and shift which aspects of mind we are aware of and what we are capable of over time. From neuroscientists, then, we learned that while it's possible to say where in the mind various processes are active, no one has yet been able to pinpoint where memories are stored or how ideas and thoughts are formed. We also saw that many responses in our body happen faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel through the body, and often show up in the body before we're aware of it. So it's clear that our consciousness and our decisions and choices aren't all originating in the individual brain. As a result, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the whole body. The brain, then, is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the senses and transmitting them to the body and the mind. We also learned that the brain modifies whatever it receives from both the bodily senses and from the mind to fit past patterns of experience, following Begg's principle that, quote, neurons that fire together wire together, unquote. And so they form what's called the default network in the brain. This means that we see and hear and feel what we expect or believe we will experience. Now, some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. This lack of brain activity may explain why most reports from those who've been through such what are called near-death experiences do not fit the patterns of expectation that are stored in their brain's neuronal connections and so are difficult at best to describe. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists regardless of whether the body is functioning. It permeates and develops with the body and the brain as it is told by the senses through the brain what the world out there is like, and as it directly takes in that information. This field that we call mind appears to be at least partly electromagnetic, because it's possible to measure electromagnetic activity for several inches and even several feet around the body, and some researchers and teachers of ancient traditions, who we call shamans, say that that field looks like a glowing egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibrations that's different from other fields, and some experiments have demonstrated that minds can vibrate along similar patterns. They resonate with each other. Such resonant minds are able to sense when the other is focusing attention on them or is about to come home. And their bodies change, and their mind activity changes when the resonant mind changes. Their bodies have been measured to change when someone they're connected with turns attention their way, even though they can't see or hear them doing so. These experiments help explain how some pets respond when their people are thinking about coming home and haven't even come close, or how the belief of a care provider in a treatment can help a patient receiving that treatment experience a reduction in symptoms and what's called the placebo effect. We've also learned that mind affects energy and matter in a variety of other ways as well. For example, in the famous double-slit experiments in quantum physics, the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. For decades now, individuals have changed the patterns of numbers in what should be random grids on their computer screens or printouts. And the collective mind has been demonstrated to change the readouts from random number generators on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project. Because of the nature of fields and because of things like the Global Consciousness Project, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual field of mind as part of a larger field, what Jung called the collective consciousness, Teilhard de Chardin called a noosphere, and others have called a global brain. More and more scientists are going beyond and saying that the field of mind extends beyond the Earth. They're equating it with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arises, some calling it the Akashic field, using the Sanskrit term that means, quote, the essence of everything that exists in the material world, unquote. We've even heard from a physicist who is using the equations that describe aspects of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of our material world. We then explored some popular ideas of how the mind works, including the law of attraction, in which the universe reflects what we are experiencing internally, or accessing information in the quantum Akashic field through our insight, intuition, and what's called channeling. We learned how dreams affect the body and our consciousness overall, and the effects of music on the brain and the body, and our connections with other fields of mind. These past few weeks, we've been looking at the role of mind and our state of consciousness in the healing process, and the ways we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, our emotions, and our visualizations. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, books, and authors that I mention. As I said, we've been focusing on the body and how we can use the mind to bring the body into greater health and well-being. Today, I want to shift from the mechanics of the healing process to the mechanics of perception, what it is, how it works, and how what we are perceiving affects our body and feelings and can be changed. More and more neuroscientists are realizing that the brain not only modifies the signals it receives, in some cases it creates signals, perceiving from previous experience and expectations rather than what is entering the senses. Dr. Aral Seth of the University of Sussex gave a TED Talk to help us understand this.
Well, for today, I'd just like to think of consciousness in two different ways. There are experiences of the world around us, full of sights, sounds, and smells, this multisensory, panoramic, 3D, fully immersive inner movie. And then there's conscious self, the specific experience of being you or being me, the lead character in this inner movie, and probably the aspect of consciousness we all cling to most tightly. Let's start with experiences of the world around us, and with the important idea of the brain as a prediction engine. Now, imagine being a brain. You're locked inside a bony skull, trying to figure what's out there in the world. There's no light inside the skull, there's no sound either. All you've got to go on are streams of electrical impulses, which are only indirectly related to things in the world, whatever they may be. So perception, figuring out what's there, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which the brain combines these sensory signals with its prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is to form its best guess of what caused those signals. The brain doesn't hear sound or see light. What we perceive is its best guess of what's out there in the world. Let me give you a couple of examples of all this, which shows just how quickly the brain can use new predictions to change what we consciously experience. Have a listen to this. Sounded strange, right? Have a listen again and see if you can get anything. Still strange. Now listen to this.
I think Brexit is a really terrible idea.
Which I do. So you heard some words there, right? Now listen to the first sound again. I'm just going to replay it. Yeah? So you can now hear words there. Once more for luck. Okay, so what's going on here is the remarkable thing is the sensory information coming into the brain hasn't changed at all. All that's changed is your brain's best guess of the causes of that sensory information, and that changes what you consciously hear. Now, all this puts the brain basis of perception in a bit of a different light. Instead of perception depending largely on signals coming into the brain from the outside world, it depends as much, if not more, on perceptual predictions flowing in the opposite direction. We don't just passively perceive the world, we actively generate it. The world we experience comes as much, if not more, from the inside out as from the outside in.
So the various connections that we've built over the years in the brain have set it up so that it will take in signals and turn them into whatever makes sense to it, regardless, almost, of what they are. I'm sure some of you, when hearing that weird high voice, were coming up with what it might be saying, and it had nothing to do with Brexit, right? So the brain is trying to figure it out. It's projecting onto the sensory inputs what it expects. And this is how we experience everyday reality all the time. If you are looking at cloudy skies and you are coming from a place of distress, you're going to experience those cloudy skies in a very different way from if you're coming from a place of happiness and joy and are being a creative, perhaps painter or something else like that. If you are listening to the voice of someone saying something to you and that voice reminds you of someone you used to listen to, you will tend to even put words in their mouth, very much as we did with that high-pitched sound, that fits the person we used to know rather than the person in front of us. Isn't that fascinating? Now, the brain is doing this while the mind sort of watches. The mind knows what's actually happening through the act of what we've been calling intuition, or channeling, if you will, through a direct connection, an overlap of resonating minds. But the brain stops whatever the mind is telling us from getting to the body because it is the receiver and transmitter. It chooses that which fits the default network. So our goal, if we are going to shift our experience day to day, must be to shift that default network in the brain, to realize that neurons that have been firing together are wiring together and are projecting our experience onto the world around us far more than receiving the information from the world around us. Now, how does this apply to healing? Well, clearly, if I am going to have a body that is well and whole, I need to feel, for example, safe. I need to feel warm and comfortable. I need to see things that are supporting feeling safe and warm and comfortable. If the brain has been wired through past trauma, through repetitive messages from a variety of sources that say the world isn't safe, then it's going to be very difficult for the body to be healthy because the signals that are going to the body from the brain are not in alignment with well-being. How do I change the default network? Well, we've done some work along that line so far, but let's look at it again. The way the brain is wired is a function of the messages it has received with intensity and or with repetition. And combine intensity and repetition, it's definitely wired into the brain. So in order to rewire the brain, we need to do several things. I'm going to refer to Joe Dispenza's work again on how to break the habit of being yourself. Also Emma Curtis Hopkins' work on shifting our belief systems from one that support not being well to beliefs that support being well, and my own work that I talked about earlier about expressing and releasing and replacing old ideas with new ones. So you can find all of those references on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, on past shows. But at this point, let's think about how we can recognize when we are projecting onto the world rather than receiving either directly through our intuition and inner awareness or indirectly through our perceptual senses what is actually happening in the world around us. One very simple and wonderful way is, how does the body feel? I've talked about this before, but if the body is feeling tense or is feeling ill at ease in a situation, it is probably projecting rather than receiving. Because when we are receiving input, the body tends to go to curiosity. The brain is a thinking machine. Second of all, a receiving machine. So the brain, when it is receiving information, will tend to question it, and the body will be relatively relaxed. Even if you're being guided to be in fight or flight, you can feel comfortable at it. You've seen this. You've seen action heroes on the TV or on the movie screen who are absolutely clear. They just move into the appropriate action. This is part of the training for much of martial arts and most of yoga. Moving into action without stress. Moving into the appropriate behavioral stance for the moment without getting upset is the normal human condition. Who knew, huh? In our culture, it hardly seems possible. But again, if you look at other cultures or you look at the ways that some training processes happen, you will see over and over again the elimination of the brain's tendencies to push the situation into distress and the activation of the mind's awareness and guidance. And when we do that, then the body can receive the information it needs, the signals it needs to express wellness and wholeness and strength and well-being in any situation. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, the show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, and how our lives could be better if we understood it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, and that sound tells me we need to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, are curious about. And I want to continue with the conversation we've been having, because for the last several weeks, it's been pretty intense. The people around me trying to understand what it is that they need to do to shift out of believing and reinforcing the belief in illness and distress into a state of being in which their norm is wellness, well-being, strength, ease, and comfort. And again, it is, do we follow the default network that has been programmed to project past stress and distress onto the world, or do we learn to either sidestep that program and move into the mind that can move comfortably, or to undo that default network program so that we are receiving more fully from the mind and less from the projections of expectations in the default network of the brain. Let's think about this in terms of just structure. If there is a structure in the brain that tends to run the same number over and over again, I'm guessing you've been listening to it. We all do. It is that background narrative. So if it is a structure, then perhaps there is a way to either break it or break into it, right? We can use music, positive music. We can use other people's sermons or radio shows like this to help us break through that default over and over again cycle of narrative. Just breaking into the structure so that something else can happen. We can also do the kind of training that is built into yoga and martial arts and many other forms of physical training that help us to not pay attention to that loop and move straight into the body-mind connection without the brain's default network interference. That is a matter of training, and usually it's a matter of focusing on what is intended over and over and over again to the point where the default structure has been rewired and is now doing this new way of being. The final way is to recognize that the structure is composed of past experience and repetition of those experiences with energy, with emotion, with feeling that says they are important. If we can begin to repeat them to the point where there is no feeling left, which is a training mechanism used in some approaches, you repeat the story that was so intense until it doesn't have any intensity left. That is one way to de-energize that default structure, and you want to immediately replace it with a different way of understanding how the world works, a different way of feeling and thinking about the world. And that replacing is so important. Whatever technique we use to break into the old structure, we must have a new one ready to come into place, which is what all the spiritual teachers have been providing us for centuries. The spiritual teachers have all offered us a different way of understanding the world, a different way of understanding who we are, a different way of understanding how we can relate to what is going on around us. The point of Buddhist meditation, yoga practice, and I'm not just talking about the body, the hatha yoga, or the prana yoga, the breathing. I'm talking about the whole set of thought and behaviors that have been called yoga in the Hindu tradition for over 1,000 years. These processes and the processes that Jesus brought through Christianity and that several of the prophets brought in the Judaic tradition are designed to help us have something to focus on, some way to understand what's real in our life and in our world that is far beyond what our culture has been programming the default thought structure to experience. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience life differently when we use it fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can always continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the titles and other resources that we refer to on the show, alongside all the archived past shows, and where you can send me your comments and questions, which I'll do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. Thanks again for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. I hope you have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.